This performance review sucks. Oh boy. Sit down. Take a deep breath. And relax. Because I know talking about performance reviews is going to get you stirred up. Hi, it's Daryl from the DCC group. Back to you with another better than set of tips for this week. And we're going to focus on the annual performance review process. And let's face it, many of you either have gone through that or are going through it or are recovering from it at this point. But the annual review process, it's a little bug that we all have to deal with. And yeah, that's how I felt most of the time with mine. Not because the people who wrote them didn't try, but because the process just had so much stacked up against it. And of course, we are all at the bottom of that hill, and you know it rolls down the hill and hits us. So why do annual reviews suck? And how can you make them better, or at least make them work for you? Well, let's dig into that. First and foremost, a lot of people hate annual reviews because they're biased. And let's face it, they are biased. If someone wrote it, it is biased. People by nature are biased. So don't take that personally. Now, here's the part you need to pay attention to. Your rating is probably somewhat a reflection of the person who wrote it for you. Don't believe me? Trust me. Reviews from managers who are considered high performers get taken a little more seriously than reviews from managers who are considered average or, even worse, low performers. And in fact, my experience has been that low-rated managers often have good-performing employees who get overlooked. And it's because of the manager, not because of the employee. Second thing about annual performance reviews is sometimes they can create too much internal competition because everybody thinks they're competing for a limited number of high or exceed ratings. And that's probably a little bit more true than anyone would like to admit, but the process itself simply introduces competition if it's not done or rolled out properly. Number 3, so many performance programs attempt to put people into predetermined performance grids. So one example would be a 9-box performance grid, but another would just be a simple bell curve rating of how many people can be in which category, ranging from needs improvement all the way up to top performer. Number 4, performance reviews rarely account fully for how a job is done, so much as what was done. And this is where superstars tend to get a little more credit than solid performers. And that may not work on your part, but it may. It depends on the perspective of the observer. Sometimes observers simply aren't close enough to the day-to-day action to understand the how. They only can see or feel the what. So it's important for you to get a real sense of where your observer or your performance giver, where their perspective is. And number 5, and this one touches me personally, is that human resources often really isn't the benchmark for the organization. So people have a tendency to have second doubts or skepticism on why this process is rolled out through human resources, especially if HR isn't a benchmark organization when it comes to doing them and setting the process up. So what's wrong with the performance review process? Well, my take on it is that you have to accept it for the completely flawed process it is. And it's not flawed because people want it flawed. It's because it just has too many things stacked up against it. First and foremost, unless you're that rare manager that only has one direct report, the number of reviews you have to write in a short window of time, usually sometime in the middle or end of December through the first part of January. Of course, you want to take time off and enjoy your holidays, but reviews are a part of that process. So there's a compressed window where reviews are generally written, and that never makes for the best experience as someone writing a review. The result is when you get your review, it generally doesn't capture nearly what you want it to, and it's not comprehensive according to how the year probably actually went. The next thing that I find most people are dissatisfied with about annual reviews is there's bias built into the system. Now, that bias can be managers giving unfair ratings to coworkers, and that unfairness can be because the manager just isn't close enough to the action to see how things are done. They may know what things are done, but they just may not be as close enough to the action as they need to be to see the how. The next thing that I find people often struggle with is the continuity of the review process. And by that I mean, does a review actually reflect how things were throughout the year? Or does it really only pick up highlights of things from the most positive to the most negative? And while those things may be important, and I certainly can't underplay when they are important, the fact is a bulk of most people's day looks similar from one day to another. There may be a lot of things that need to happen on a day-to-day basis that simply never make it onto a review. No one really adequately accounts for business as usual on reviews. They tend to highlight spikes in performance or things that were projects, special projects, or headline items that everyone else was aware of. But true attention may not be paid to the day-to-day. And if the day-to-day accounts for 90 to 95% of your work, then you're just naturally going to feel like your review slighted you and that the reviewer who wrote it also slighted you. Again, if you Google why are people dissatisfied with the performance review process, you'll get a ton of different answers, but let me give you my top 3. 1, they rarely shape or guide performance. The process just isn't ongoing enough throughout the year for you to use the feedback to actually get better from day to day, month to month, week to week, quarter to quarter, and year to year. Very rarely does the performance process really account for, here's some feedback, here's what I'd like you to do with it or use it, or how I'd like you to use it, and let's talk about it again at the next review period. Sure, there's a lot of review of goals and project status, but it's rarely done in the right developmental way that performance reviews should guide, but simply don't. The second is performance reviews kind of feel like a way to justify pay actions at the end of the year. And that's the ugly truth that it probably is. And I think that tie with pay action is the number one reason why the review process from an individual's interpretation isn't as effective as it could be. Because at the end of the day, we're all thinking, so what does this mean to my paycheck? And I'm not sure that that's the way performance is best served and best taken. And finally, my perspective is that reviews vary from manager to manager and person to person. And there's an inordinate lack of consistency because there isn't a single rater who's aware of all situations and all levels of performance. So the fact is, the business situation can dictate a certain type of performance for someone who's already experienced, but it can dictate an entirely different type of performance from someone who's just learning the job. And so when people who are rated equally, who one is aware that they're already using material or background that they know versus someone that they might even be training or teaching or guiding or mentoring, and that person gets the same rating, it never feels good for the experienced person. So where do we go from here? Well, I'll give some advice as a former performance reviewer and someone who wrote reviews. I'll give some advice from the perspective of someone who received several performance reviews. And I'll give a final set of advice for those of you who may be in charge of rolling out and administering the performance review process. And we'll tie it all up to where can we go from here as a group. As a performance reviewer, I think the single greatest piece of advice I would give is to make the written and informal appraisal process ongoing, and to link it to one-on-one meetings that happen on a regular basis and formalize those in documentation with follow-up emails or in an actual document so that the performance is accounted for, even if for some reason you are no longer the one at the end of the year leaving that performance. I know that often is something that hurts employees. When a manager moves on, the employee feels like their work is not going to be adequately recognized. But if you keep that discussion and documentation ongoing, then you'll always have something to leave behind. It'll also be easier for you at the end of the year because it might be simpler to simply reference back to the ongoing notes and discussion with a summary one-page document than to literally try to write a review at the end of the year. I think one of the best things I ever did was not try to write an end-of-year review because it simply should have been a recap of things that were already written and stated. And once I got good at that, I feel like the performance process worked better. As someone who received performance reviews, this is where the process can vary from person to person. But what did work for me was that same process of documenting discussions and following up in each subsequent discussion, noting where I'd gained a skill and applied it and asked for feedback on how well it helped my performance in comparison to what the business needs were or what my manager's needs were. But the other thing that I did, which I found unique, was I tried to always write a one-year performance review for myself. And I did that by writing a one-year resume. And what that actually helped me do on an individual level was to see if I was actually growing and developing in the job. Because when you write it to yourself in resume format, it makes it very clear whether you're actually growing and developing in your job or whether it's become a mundane, day in, day out, no growth situation. The big challenge for me, having been responsible for the rollout of the annual review process, was trying to separate giving the performance feedback from the pay finality of those discussions. And it's inevitable that that's what people focus on. So what I actually tried to do was advise anyone giving feedback to have already discussed with their team how the pay process actually works out, and that it will be connected to the performance process, and that the employee should focus exclusively on that because the business factor will tell us what the actual pay implications are. And I know that doesn't feel comfortable, but the reality is business can give you an opportunity to enhance pay, or it can put some constraints on pay. Nevertheless, the feedback has to be a critical part of that process. And people will have a difficult time accepting pay when it's less than expected or hoped for. But the reality is, as long as the feedback is valid, understandable, and accurate, then the decision about pay at least tends to be isolated into this is really what the business reality is versus the muddied waters of business reality and not accurate feedback. Have I ever considered completely dropping the annual review process? Yes, I actually have. It's a business case that I made, not successfully, but I did make it a few times, because what I really wanted was to actually have an ongoing review process that we could actually do pay allocations at any point during the year. So for spot increases or spot bonuses, I wanted to see a performance appraisal process that could accurately capture that moment when we wanted to make that decision down to an individual level. And unfortunately, it tends not to be the case when there's an overbearing annual review process. So let's go back and see how it all worked out for me. What's the best review I did? Well, I'm not sure that it would totally align with how everyone felt, because there's always a little bit of individual interpretation, but I do believe in one situation, I actually just gave one-page summaries of our weekly meetings from throughout the year. And when I gave those summaries out, I said it literally is just a review of everything we've already talked about. The reason I think that process worked out best was because I didn't feel like I had to create anything new to fit any narrative or any agenda. It literally was just a one-page summary of everything that had already been discussed. And not so coincidentally, the best review I ever got was literally a one-page summary that mirrored that exact same process. An executive wrote out what he thought the highlights were based on our discussion ongoing throughout the year, the milestones and highlights that we discussed at the time throughout the year, and literally at the end where that whole pay thing came in, it actually made the most sense because it literally looked like just a reflection of what had happened. It also happened to be the one review that I went into knowing exactly how it was going to work out in the end. And I was very content with it because it happened to be one of my strong performing years. Where I find the most challenging has been when I've been responsible for rolling out an annual review process, because I've yet to work with a management team, both internally or externally, that truly accepted that the process was inherently flawed and that our goal was to make the process of giving feedback real time and ongoing and year round, and that the annual process was literally almost nothing to take into consideration. But unfortunately, that's just mentally not how most of the management teams think. So it's always been an adjustment. As an external advisor, it's always an adjustment. As an internal HR person, it's probably still that same ongoing adjustment. But it's not something that I think we should give up on, because while there are calls to eliminate the annual review process, I don't think that they truly mean stop giving review feedback. I just think they want to take the emphasis off the annual part of it and make it an ongoing real-time process. And again, as I said, what that actually also helps is when there's a change in management or who your direct reviewer is, it doesn't leave you in a position where you have to make up ground or that the new reviewer can't come in and get a quick assessment of where you stand based on what your previous manager thought. I know HR systems can be of help to the process, but they actually need to be set up to be helpful. They need to be real-time documentation processes so that managers actually don't have to go back in and rewrite reviews or write a narrative around something that's already happened. I think those narratives are best done real-time when they're happening and not after the fact. So how would I make the process better if I was an internal HR person? Well, first and foremost, I would actually have regular intervals where performance documentation is assessed. If it's captured in a system, then it should be reviewed in a system on a regular basis, not at the end of the year. Secondly, I would work with managers to find out if they understand that they really don't need to write reviews at the end of the year if they give the feedback and document the feedback during the year. And finally, I try to reestablish a little bit of separation between the annual review and the pay decisions that are linked to it. And that separation probably at best is going to be reviews will be done before the end of the year. And pay decisions may still not happen until the end of January, February, or into March. But the reality is when there's a little bit of gap and separation, then people can focus a little bit more on the feedback part of the process. So, what do you think about annual performance reviews? How would you change the process? What are some ideas you have on how things could be done differently or better? Let us know in the comments, and let us know if you have a situation where you feel like it's being done on a better level and you have tips to share with us. And I'll call those out in one of my upcoming videos. Thanks, and feel free to share this with someone if you think it would help. Subscribe, like, and help us out with the YouTube algorithm.